You have a fullback, Lily. You have a defensive line. You got to fight later. Are you ready? She's ready. You ready to go in? 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 She is ready. Oh, I know what she thinks she's getting. Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and Friends of Baylor. For you who don't know, we in Texas like our football. And when I first moved here, I was asked the key question, what are the two favorite sports in Texas? And they are football and spring football. So we take our football very seriously. Not me, of course. I'm very neutral, even though I went to the University of Michigan and went to the game, and of course we won. Anyway, lots of good questions over the holidays, but I thought before we start that, give you an update, because we're right in the middle of respiratory virus season. The first thing I was kind of sad is that the polar bears who are already endangered, there's a report that they have been contracting some of that bird flu. We talked about the lethal bird flu that has been a real problem this year. Well, one of the polar bears died from a lethal bird flu, so polar bears are not getting a chance by anything. So let me give you a little bit of an update in general on COVID. One thing is the pandemic is far from over. We are seeing a huge surge in cases, mostly due to this new variant, which we'll talk about. But basically, we probably should name it. The problem is we haven't named the JN1 variant. The last one was Omicron. We should make this one maybe we should name it after the quarterback at Washington. We should name it Penix or something. But it needs a name so that we all know who it is. But it's bad. Emergency room visits are up 13%. Hospitalizations are up 20%. Deaths due to COVID are up 13%. And it's not surprising with this huge change in the spike protein. It's a lot like when Omicron first arrived on the scene. And it's a really big problem. The good news is there's some recent data that shows that the latest version of the booster, the XBB 1.5 booster, does give pretty good protection against this JN1 variant. About 60% benefit for hospitalizations and serious disease. And if you look at those who are unvaccinated, the older version of the vaccine does not seem to be very protective for JN1. So if you ever need an excuse to go get your updated vaccine, there's plenty of data to support it. So again, hospitalizations are up pretty dramatically, not nearly as bad as the Omicron, Delta, or Alpha surges, but if you look at JN1, it's going up. And it's particularly up in the 70-plus year age group. And deaths I've mentioned this before, but deaths due to COVID are also on the rise. Interestingly enough, the number of sites that are reporting either a 100% or 200% increase in the amount of virus in wastewater is about the same, about half of the sites in the United States. But that dynamic is interesting because it's regional. Some are going up, some are going down. So in areas where there's an outbreak, you see an increase in wastewater. For example, we were very low in the South, and now it's rising. This is an interesting graph that was shown by Eric Topol on his blog. This is the level currently of wastewater amount of virus. And if you go back and look at the Omicron surge, it's about half what it was. So much more than what's been before, but not what it was during Omicron, but still pretty significant. And here in Houston, it is really up a lot. So almost all the sites are reporting an increase. We're at now 330% of the viral load that we had in July of 2020, almost back to where we were in September. So we're seeing a lot of virus here. And I know a lot of people are COVID positive. I have a lot of friends and acquaintances, colleagues who are at work are showing up with COVID. And the reason is this JN1 variant. You can see just in November how little it was, and now it's totally dominant. I mentioned this before. The BA 2.86 variant was the one that was identified in Europe and had over 30 mutations. We were all concerned it would be like Omicron and take over, and it didn't until it acquired one additional mutation in the spike protein, became JN1, and it is now the dominant species. So if we just think about, we're now 4 4 years past the beginning of the start of the pandemic. We're in our 5th year. And the thing we're learning is this virus is really good at escaping from all of the resources we have. I mean, it keeps finding a way to mutate to avoid either immune detection or improve its ability to infect people. And so while people are pretending the pandemic is over, it's really not. And a lot of people say, well, it's like the common cold. Well, it's not. It's still a global pandemic. And the promise, of course, the concern, of course, is that as long as there's replicating virus, it will continue to mutate until we get more people who are willing to be vaccinated. Basically, now, with only 20% of the United States population vaccinated, we have 80% of people who are vulnerable to getting infected. Better vaccines, and people will be more willing to get them. Okay, I wanted to answer a few questions that came over the holiday season because they're really interesting. We've mentioned some of them, but these keep coming up, and I thought I'd go over those again today. So one of the ones is, is there a genetic basis for why some people don't seem to get COVID? And this person went through, we have friends who are vaccinated, and the husband has come down with COVID for the first time. He's fully vaccinated, boosted, but some people don't seem to get it at all. Is there a reason for that? Well, there was a recent study. We talked about this study before, but it's really the first study to really show a genetic reason why people are asymptomatic. So this was a study looking at HLA types of blood. The HLA system is sort of instructs the immune system how to work, and there's a number of different versions of the HLA system. And so this was a study that looked at 30,000 individuals who actually had HLA gene typing, and 20% of them who were reported being infected but asymptomatic. And there were about, of these 30,000, 1,500 people who were unvaccinated but asymptomatic but reported being COVID positive. So infected, known to be infected, but asymptomatic. And they were tested for the HLA loci, and it turns out one of in particular was common in this human leukocyte antigen protein. And this particular version allowed them to be asymptomatic. So 20% of the people remained asymptomatic if they had one version of this allele. And if they had two versions, they were 8-fold more likely to be asymptomatic. So there's a really good example of where an immune marker is associated with being asymptomatic. And the theory behind that is that their lymphocytes seem to be able to recognize this virus because it's similar to other coronaviruses, whereas other people don't seem to be able to recognize it at all. So even though they get infected, their immune system is responding as almost like they were previously vaccinated, or at least they recognize it. So very interesting study that gives some evidence for why there's a genetic basis for asymptomatic infection. Then there was this question, does the latest COVID vaccine confer protection from hospitalization and ER visits? And the answer to that is yes. I just went over and mentioned that Kaiser Permanente study seems to confer a 60% benefit against JN1. And so if you are vaccinated with the most recent version of the vaccine, this XBB 1.5, it does provide significant protection against not only infection, against serious infection and hospitalization. This is a really interesting study looking at why is it that people seem to not be wearing masks and social distancing anymore, and what is the effect of that? Well, it's interesting because if you look at previous pandemics, this is the plague in Bombay, swine flu in Australia, West Nile virus in Texas, foot and mouth disease in Cumbria, and then even monkeypox. You can see after these spikes in disease, the disease goes down. And even though there's not been a vaccination strategy or anything, the disease goes down. Why is that? Because people behave differently. They avoid contact. They naturally try to not get infected. The difference is with the politicization of everything we do around COVID, everyone's pretending it's gone. Well, we didn't do that. And what's happening? There's not been that same dip like there has been in other previous pandemics. And so the issue is human behavior really does dictate a lot of these things, and maybe we should stop pretending that it's all gone and start behaving a little bit more like we still have a global pandemic. This question I was asked a few weeks ago, but also I think it's important. Is there any data how many people would have died if we'd not mandated vaccines? Because everyone's always bad-mouthing everyone who mandated vaccines. Well, the Commonwealth Fund actually looked at this. They looked at 2 years between December 2020 and November 2022, and they noticed that, or they did the calculation, the country's vaccination program probably prevented 18 million hospitalizations and more than 3 million deaths. There was another paper that looked at how many could have been saved had they been vaccinated, and between May of 2021 and September of 2022, in the European Journal of Epidemiology, there was a calculation that about 232,000 deaths could have been prevented had people gotten vaccinated. So from a lot of different views, the vaccine has been very effective. It's just a question of, are people willing to adopt it? One question that is recurring is there going to be an inhaled COVID vaccine? That would help a lot. You know, people are reluctant to get shots. They could do this very easily. Might be better protection. There are two good candidates. One is an inhaled single-dose dry powder that is the receptor binding domain, that spike protein of the virus, along with cholera toxin B as an adjuvant and a nanoparticle. And that seems to have very high production of antibodies, particularly of the IgA type, so mucosal immunity, and very effective against Omicron and other variants. So that's coming along. That looks like a real promising one. And then there's another one that has been used, an adenovirus vector, that using the J&J formulation, and that seems to be very good as well. So there are two potential oral and or tracheal, nasal potential vaccines coming out. This is an interesting question somebody asked about. We know COVID vaccines help with pregnant mothers. What about the flu vaccine? Is there any evidence getting a flu vaccine when you're pregnant helps the children? And there actually was a recent study that shows that flu vaccine to mothers particularly is protective against serious disease in infants under the age of 6 months, and particularly under the age of 3 months, where they're very dependent upon the mother's antibodies. It was 50% protective against serious flu disease in kids. So that was a really interesting one. And then there was a recent question about, people seem to have a loss of exercise tolerance during long COVID, and there was a good study that explained that there's some issues around the mitochondrial enzyme activity of muscle being inhibited by COVID, and so that's another interesting study to explain some of the long COVID syndromes. So lots of good data coming out and very interesting studies. But I think I want to remind everybody, there's still there's a lot of flu out there. There's a lot of RSV, and COVID is really surging right now. So please be careful if you're, test if you're symptomatic, and make sure that you, if you're gathering with people, make sure people are either asymptomatic or testing. I want to end today with the obvious football shout-outs. First of all, congratulations to Houston Texans. I mean, they've had some tough times, and they were, came back, and they're now in the playoffs, led by their Ohio State quarterback and their University of Michigan wide receiver. So very proud of the Big Ten for what they've done. And of course, the most important news is Michigan is the national champion. I can't tell you how important it is. Most people think we Michigan fans suffer a lot and have no reason for it. But I have a particular shout out to my favorite University of Michigan football player, Mike Lantry. Mike Lantry, many of you may not know, but in my era, we all know him. Grew up in Oxford, Michigan. He started in football, set many records. He was a Vietnam vet who walked onto the Michigan football team and was the kicker for Michigan. And he was set records for kicking and all that kind of stuff. But maybe best known for 2 football seasons that I'm still suffering from, the 73 game where Michigan and Ohio State were tied 10-10, and he had a chance to win the game in the end and missed a field goal. And then the next year,
I'm not on camera. Once again, the pressure is apparently coming down on the shoulders of Mike Lantry, the Michigan field goal kicker. Remember that twice in the last 5 minutes a year ago, Lantry missed field goals that would have won the ball game for Michigan and sent them to the Rose Bowl.
He will kick out of the hold of Tom Drake. He's a remarkable story. He is from Oxford, Michigan. He was a walk-on. He just showed up one day and said, "Coach, I want to play football for you." He, right now, might very well write his name indelibly in Michigan football history. One of the richest collegiate history books of them all. He is a left-footed kicker. He is a senior. He has a 37-yarder. This one is from 33 yards. The wind is at his back. Only 18 seconds to play in the ball game. The placement is good. The kick
kicked the ball, and everybody thought it was good, but the refs said it was no good. Now, we know it was good, and we know that the world's been against Michigan ever since. And so this is why we took great pride. And if you're out there, Mike Lantry, congratulations. I think this win was for you. Anyway, I want everybody to have a great weekend. Can't wait to see you next week, and go Blue.